The morning sun streamed through the classroom windows of Lincoln Heights Public School in Chicago as Jasmine Williams adjusted her freshly styled afro in her compact mirror. Other students filtered into the classroom, some offering compliments on her hair, which she had spent hours perfecting with her mother the night before. At 13, this was the first time she felt confident enough to wear her natural hair to school. Mrs. Margaret Peterson stood at the front of the classroom, her thin lips pressed into a tight line as she watched Jasmine enter. She tapped her pen against the desk rhythmically, her steel-gray hair pulled back so severely it looked painful. The classroom fell silent as her disapproving gaze fixed on Jasmine's hair. "Miss Williams," Margaret's voice cut through the quiet. "I see you've decided to make quite the statement today." The way she emphasized statement made it clear this wasn't a compliment. A few students shifted uncomfortably in their seats while others stared at their desks, avoiding eye contact. Jasmine's shoulders tensed, but she held her head high as she took her seat in the third row. She had expected some reaction, but the open hostility in Margaret's tone caught her off guard. The teacher's heels clicked against the linoleum as she approached Jasmine's desk. During the lesson on American history, Margaret made pointed comments about proper appearance and professional standards. She distributed a new classroom policy document, reading aloud with particular emphasis, "All students must maintain a neat, professional appearance. Hair must be controlled and appropriate for an academic setting." The other students watched as Jasmine's fingers curled into fists under her desk. Marcus, sitting next to her, whispered, "Don't let her get to you." But Margaret's words continued to cut deep, each one carefully chosen to single out Jasmine's appearance. The situation escalated during the third period. Margaret approached Jasmine's desk with a pair of scissors she retrieved from her drawer. "This has gone on long enough," she announced to the stunned classroom. "If you won't conform to appropriate standards, I'll help you." Before anyone could react, Margaret grabbed a section of Jasmine's hair. The classroom erupted in chaos. Students jumped from their seats, shouting in protest. "Stop!" Jasmine screamed, trying to pull away, but Margaret's grip was firm. The scissors made a harsh snipping sound as they cut through Jasmine's hair. Tommy Chen, a sophomore with trembling hands, held up his phone, recording the entire incident. Other students followed suit, their phones capturing Margaret's actions from different angles. The sound of Jasmine's sobs mixed with the outraged voices of her classmates. Chunks of dark, curly hair fell to the floor around Jasmine's desk. Margaret continued cutting with methodical precision, ignoring the protests and the phones recording her actions. Her face showed no emotion, as if she were simply trimming a hedge rather than assaulting a student's dignity and identity. The videos started uploading to social media platforms immediately, even as Margaret continued her assault on Jasmine's hair. The timestamp on Tommy's video would later show that the incident lasted exactly 6 minutes and 23 seconds before it was interrupted, 6 minutes that would change the school forever and spark a controversy that would ripple through the entire Chicago school system. The door to classroom 237 burst open as David Williams stormed in, his presence commanding immediate attention. As both the school's new principal and Jasmine's father, the sight before him froze him in place, his daughter, tears streaming down her face, with uneven patches of hair and scissors still hovering near her head. The room fell into a deafening silence. "What in God's name are you doing?" David's voice trembled with barely contained rage. His tall frame blocked the doorway as other teachers and staff members gathered behind him, drawn by the commotion. Margaret lowered the scissors slowly, her posture straightening as she prepared to defend herself. "Mr. Williams," Margaret began, her voice steady and self-righteous. "As I was just explaining to the class, we have standards here. Your daughter's hair was becoming a distraction to other students. This is a simple disciplinary measure to ensure." "A disciplinary measure?" David cut her off, his voice rising. "You're assaulting my daughter." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, positioning himself between Margaret and Jasmine. The scissors clattered to the desk as Margaret stepped back. Meanwhile, the students' phones continued recording. The original video of the incident had already been shared hundreds of times in the past few minutes. #JusticeForJasmine started trending locally on Twitter, with students from other classes and schools picking up the hashtag and resharing the footage. David turned to the class, his principal training kicking in despite his personal anguish. "Everyone, please go to the library. Mrs. Rodriguez will supervise you." The students filed out, many shooting supportive looks at Jasmine or glaring at Margaret. Tommy Chen paused at the door, his phone still recording, until a gentle nudge from another student moved him along. As soon as the last student left, David turned back to Margaret. "Give me one good reason why I shouldn't call the police right now." His hands were shaking as he helped Jasmine to her feet, examining the damage to her hair. Margaret's composure cracked slightly. "This is ridiculous. I was enforcing school policy." "Show me the policy," David demanded. "Show me exactly where it says teachers can physically assault students over their natural hair." When Margaret remained silent, he continued, "You're suspended, effective immediately. Security will escort you to collect your belongings." The school security officer appeared at the door, having been summoned by another staff member. As Margaret was led away, she maintained her rigid posture, but her face had lost its certainty. The reality of her actions seemed to be setting in. In the hallway, students had gathered with their phones out, recording Margaret's exit. The video of her being escorted out would soon join the others circulating online. Within an hour, local news stations would pick up the story, and within 2, national media would be calling the school for comments. David hugged Jasmine close, feeling her body shake with sobs. "I'm so sorry, baby," he whispered. "This shouldn't have happened to you." But even as he comforted his daughter, he knew this was just the beginning. His phone was already buzzing with messages from the school board, parents, and media outlets. That evening, as #JusticeForJasmine continued to trend nationally, David sat in his office drafting a statement to the school community. The incident had sparked a larger conversation about institutional racism and discrimination in schools. He knew that suspending Margaret wasn't enough, systematic changes needed to be made. The school auditorium buzzed with nervous energy as students filed in for the mandatory assembly. A week had passed since the incident, and David had spent that time organizing this moment carefully. The stage held a single podium, its microphone standing ready like a silent sentinel. Jasmine sat in the front row, wearing a colorful head wrap that concealed the damage to her hair. Her hands fidgeted in her lap as she watched her father approach the podium. The whispers in the auditorium died down as David cleared his throat. "What happened last week," David began, his voice steady despite his inner turmoil, "was not just an attack on one student. It was an attack on our entire community." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Today, we're going to have an honest conversation about racism, discrimination, and the changes we need to make." The assembly wasn't the typical lecture format students expected. Instead, David had arranged chairs in a large circle on the stage, inviting students to share their experiences. When he called Jasmine's name, the auditorium grew completely still. Jasmine's legs felt like lead as she walked to the stage. She had practiced her speech countless times in front of her mirror, but facing hundreds of her peers was different. Taking her seat in the circle, she gripped the microphone handed to her. "I didn't want to speak today," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Then, stronger, "I didn't want to be the face of this conversation. But silence is what allows discrimination to continue." She touched her head wrap self-consciously. "My hair isn't just hair. It's part of who I am, my culture, my identity." When Mrs. Peterson cut it, she wasn't just cutting hair, she was trying to cut away a part of me. As Jasmine spoke, other students began raising their hands. Maria Rodriguez shared how teachers had mocked her accent. James Chin described being told to eat American food at lunch. Each story built upon the last, creating a tapestry of shared experiences that many had never dared to voice before. The atmosphere in the auditorium shifted from tension to something more profound, understanding. Even students who had never experienced discrimination firsthand began to grasp the weight of their peers' daily struggles. However, the spotlight began to weigh heavily on Jasmine. During breaks between speakers, she noticed phones pointed in her direction, people whispering and pointing. Her story was becoming bigger than herself, and the pressure to be a perfect symbol of resistance felt suffocating. One student stood up without being called. "But isn't this making too big a deal out of everything? It was just one teacher who made a mistake." The comment sparked heated responses, threatening to derail the assembly's purpose. David stepped in, maintaining order while ensuring every voice was heard, even the dissenting ones. He knew that real change wouldn't come from silencing opposition but from addressing it head-on. As the assembly concluded, the students filed out with mixed emotions. Some were energized, ready to fight for change. Others seemed uncomfortable, confronted with realities they'd preferred to ignore. And Jasmine. She sat alone on the stage after everyone left, overwhelmed by the responsibility thrust upon her. "You did good," David said softly, sitting beside her. But they both knew this was just the beginning of a longer, harder journey. The Diversity Training Center occupied a modern office building in downtown Chicago, its glass walls reflecting the morning sun. Margaret Peterson sat stiffly in her chair, arms crossed, as other educators filtered into the mandatory sensitivity training session. Her suspension would only be lifted after completing the program, a requirement she viewed as punishment rather than opportunity. The facilitator, Dr. Angela Chen, stood before the group with an air of quiet authority. "We're not here to shame anyone," she began, meeting Margaret's defensive gaze. "We're here to understand the impact of our actions and beliefs on the students we're meant to protect." The first exercise required participants to share their own experiences with discrimination. Margaret remained silent, jaw clenched, as others spoke. A black male teacher described being mistaken for janitorial staff despite his doctorate. An Asian American educator recalled being told she spoke English surprisingly well by parents. During the lunch break, Margaret sat alone, picking at her salad. The isolation felt foreign to someone who'd always been part of the educational establishment. Now, even other teachers avoided her table, not wanting to be associated with the haircutting teacher, whose actions had made national news. The afternoon session hit harder. Dr. Chen played videos of former students describing the lasting impact of discriminatory treatment by teachers. One story particularly resonated. A woman in her 40s still remembered being told her natural hair was unprofessional by her third-grade teacher. "That was different," Margaret muttered, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. Dr. Chen heard her. "How was it different, Mrs. Peterson?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Margaret. For the first time, Margaret struggled to articulate her reasoning. "We need standards," she began, but her voice wavered. "Structure. Discipline." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "And whose standards are we using?" Dr. Chen pressed. "Whose definition of professional? Of beautiful?" She projected an image on the screen, a collection of natural black hairstyles throughout history. "These standards you're defending, Mrs. Peterson, they have a history. A history of exclusion." The breaking point came during a role-playing exercise. Margaret was asked to play a student whose cultural identity was being erased by a teacher. As she acted out the scene, something shifted. Tears began rolling down her cheeks, surprising even herself. During the afternoon break, Dr. Chen found Margaret in the bathroom, trying to compose herself. "It's uncomfortable, isn't it?" she said gently. "Realizing we might have been wrong all these years." Margaret looked at her reflection in the mirror, seeing herself clearly for perhaps the first time. "I was so sure I was helping them," she whispered. "Preparing them for the real world." "And what kind of real world are we preparing them for?" Dr. Chen asked. "One that continues to exclude and discriminate, or one that celebrates diversity?" The final session of the day focused on practical changes. Margaret, who had arrived defensive and angry, found herself taking notes. The weight of her actions toward Jasmine felt heavier with each passing hour, but so did the possibility of redemption through genuine change. The converted classroom buzzed with energy as students filed in for the first meeting of STAND, Students Together Against Negative Discrimination. Jasmine had arranged the desks in a circle, reminiscent of the assembly format but more intimate. Posters celebrating different cultures and identities decorated the walls, each one carefully chosen to represent the school's diverse population. "Welcome," Jasmine said, her voice stronger now than it had been at the assembly. Her hair was growing back unevenly, but she'd stopped hiding it under wraps, instead wearing it as a visible reminder of why they were there. "This is a safe space. Whatever you share here stays here." The group started small, 15 students from different backgrounds, each carrying their own stories of discrimination. Maria Rodriguez, the first to speak, shared how teachers consistently mispronounced her name despite corrections. James Chen described the lunchroom isolation he faced when bringing traditional Chinese food from home. As weeks passed, the group grew. Students who'd initially come seeking support began offering it to others. They developed a buddy system for newcomers, ensuring no one had to face discrimination alone. The meetings evolved from simple sharing sessions to active planning for change. Jasmine found herself growing into her leadership role, though not without struggles. Some nights she lay awake, wondering if she was doing enough, if she was the right person to lead this movement. But during meetings, seeing the impact on her fellow students, those doubts faded. The group's influence spread beyond their weekly meetings. They started a newsletter highlighting different cultural celebrations and traditions. Students began standing up for each other in hallways and classrooms, calling out discriminatory behavior when they saw it. The school's atmosphere began to shift, slowly but noticeably. Planning for the cultural celebration became their biggest project yet. Students volunteered to share elements of their heritage, traditional dances, music, food, and stories. The event would be more than just a showcase, it would be a statement about the beauty of their diverse community. During one meeting, a freshman named Tyler broke down while sharing his experience as a transgender student. The group's response was immediate and supportive, surrounding him with acceptance. This moment crystallized the group's purpose. They weren't just fighting discrimination, they were building a new kind of community. Jasmine's confidence grew with each success. She learned to delegate responsibilities, to trust others with pieces of the mission. Her initial group of supporters became a team of leaders, each bringing unique strengths to their shared cause. The preparation for the cultural celebration consumed their after-school hours. Students practiced performances, created displays, and worked on presentations. Parents began getting involved, offering to cook traditional dishes and help with costumes. What had started as a student initiative was becoming a community movement. However, success brought its own challenges. As STAND's influence grew, so did resistance from some quarters. Anonymous notes appeared in Jasmine's locker, telling her to stop causing trouble. But for every negative reaction, the group's solidarity grew stronger. David Williams sat in his office, staring at the stack of angry letters from parents opposing STAND and the upcoming cultural celebration. Each envelope contained thinly veiled threats wrapped in concerned parent rhetoric about maintaining traditional values and avoiding political agendas in schools. The tension had been building gradually. What started as whispered complaints had evolved into organized opposition. A group calling themselves Parents for Traditional Education had formed, led by some of the more conservative families in the district. They'd started attending school board meetings en masse, demanding David's removal as principal. During a particularly heated Parent-Teacher Association meeting, Sarah Thompson, a prominent local attorney and mother of 2 students, stood up. "Mr. Williams is using his position to push a radical agenda," she declared. "Our children shouldn't be forced to participate in social experiments." The situation escalated when Jasmine found threatening notes in her locker. "Go back to where you came from, and your kind doesn't belong here, we're just the beginning." David's protective instincts warred with his professional responsibilities as both father and principal. That evening, as the Williams family sat at their dinner table, the tension finally broke. "Someone followed me home today," Jasmine's mother, Lisa, revealed quietly. "A car. They stayed 3 cars behind, but I noticed them." The fork in David's hand clattered against his plate. The threats weren't just anonymous anymore. Phone calls came at all hours. Social media accounts were flooded with hateful messages. Some parents pulled their children from classes, claiming the school had become too political. David found himself walking a tightrope. Every decision he made was scrutinized. Supporting his daughter in the student movement meant risking his position, but backing down meant betraying everything he believed in as an educator and father. The opposition grew more organized. Parents for Traditional Education hired a lawyer and threatened legal action against the school. They claimed the cultural celebration discriminated against traditional American values and demanded it be canceled. Despite the pressure, Jasmine remained determined. She worked on her speech for the cultural celebration, even as more threatening notes appeared. "I won't let them silence us," she told her father one evening. "That's what they want, for us to be scared and quiet." The situation reached a breaking point when David received an envelope containing photos of Jasmine walking to school, clearly taken without their knowledge. Attached was a note, "Cancel the celebration or else." He immediately contacted the police, but the message was clear: this had gone beyond school politics. An emergency meeting was called with the school board. David presented evidence of the escalating threats, while also defending the importance of STAND and the cultural celebration. The board seemed sympathetic but worried about liability and negative publicity. We could postpone the celebration, one board member suggested. Wait for things to calm down. But David stood firm. If we back down now, we're teaching our students that intimidation works. That hate wins. Leaving the meeting, David knew he'd probably put his job on the line. But watching Jasmine lead her group, seeing the change in students who'd found their voice, he knew it was worth it. The cultural celebration would go forward, despite the threats. They just needed to figure out how to keep everyone safe. The morning of the cultural celebration arrived with a mixture of anticipation and tension. Police cars were discreetly stationed around the school perimeter, their presence both reassuring and unsettling. Security guards checked bags at every entrance, while plainclothes officers mingled with the arriving crowd. The school gymnasium had been transformed. Colorful banners representing different cultures hung from the ceiling, and student-created exhibits lined the walls. The air filled with the aromas of diverse foods prepared by families who'd insisted on participating despite the threats. Students began arriving in traditional dress from their various cultural backgrounds. Maria wore her grandmother's embroidered Mexican dress, while James proudly displayed his family's traditional Chinese silk jacket. Each outfit told a story of heritage and pride. Jasmine stood backstage, adjusting her African print dress, her heart pounding. The growing crowd in the gymnasium included both supporters and known opponents. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see members of Parents for Traditional Education sitting together, their faces set in disapproving masks. As the event began, David took the stage. "Today," he announced, his voice steady despite the tension, "we celebrate not just diversity, but unity. Not just tolerance, but acceptance." His eyes met those of the opposition group, unflinching. The performances began. A group of students performed traditional Indian dance, followed by Korean drumming. Each presentation was met with applause, though the Parents for Traditional Education group sat stone-faced, occasionally whispering among themselves. Then, movement at the back of the gymnasium caught everyone's attention. Margaret Peterson entered quietly, taking a seat near the exit. A murmur rippled through the crowd. She hadn't been seen at school since her suspension, and her presence now sent mixed signals. When it was Jasmine's turn to speak, the room fell silent. She approached the microphone, her hands trembling slightly but her voice clear. 2 months ago, someone tried to cut away my identity, she began. They thought they could silence me, shame me, make me conform. As she spoke, a few members of the opposition group stood up, apparently planning to leave in protest. But then something unexpected happened. Margaret Peterson stood as well, but instead of leaving, she walked to the front of the gymnasium. "Please," Margaret's voice carried across the room. "Listen to her." The protesters paused, confused by their former allies' action. Margaret continued, "I was wrong. We've all been wrong." Her voice broke slightly. "These children aren't threatening our values, they're teaching us new ones." The tension in the room shifted. Some of the protesters slowly sat back down. Others remained standing, uncertain. Jasmine continued her speech, stronger now, talking about the importance of embracing differences and standing together against discrimination. As she spoke, more students joined her on stage, members of STAND, each representing different backgrounds, different stories, but united in purpose. The sight was powerful, dozens of students standing together, a living testament to the strength of diversity. Yet even in this moment of triumph, undercurrents of resistance remained. Some parents walked out. Others stayed but refused to participate in the standing ovation that followed Jasmine's speech. The battle wasn't over, but something had shifted in the school's atmosphere. In the wake of the cultural celebration's success, David didn't waste time. He gathered his administrative team to draft a new comprehensive diversity curriculum. The proposal included mandatory cultural sensitivity training for teachers, the integration of diverse perspectives in literature and history classes, and regular cultural awareness activities throughout the academic year. The new curriculum faced immediate pushback. Conservative board members questioned its necessity, while Parents for Traditional Education launched a campaign claiming it would indoctrinate students. Local media picked up the story, turning school board meetings into heated public forums. Meanwhile, Jasmine and her STAND members organized fundraising events to support the initiative. They held bake sales featuring international cuisines, organized multicultural art auctions, and created a crowdfunding campaign that gained traction on social media. Their efforts attracted attention from civil rights organizations and educational reform groups. Margaret's return to teaching proved challenging. Her classroom, once a place of absolute authority, now felt hostile. Students whispered behind her back, some openly defiant. Despite her public apology and obvious efforts to change, the trust she'd broken seemed irreparable. During one particularly difficult class, a student deliberately wore an elaborate African head wrap, staring Margaret down as she entered. The old Margaret would have demanded its removal. Instead, she asked the student to explain its cultural significance to the class. The moment was uncomfortable but marked a small step toward healing. David's implementation of the new curriculum proceeded methodically. He introduced elements gradually, starting with teacher training sessions and slowly integrating new materials into existing classes. The English department began incorporating more diverse authors, while history classes expanded beyond the traditional Eurocentric narrative. The fundraising efforts gained momentum. Local businesses, inspired by the students' dedication, began matching donations. Several civil rights organizations offered grants for diversity programs. Even some initially resistant parents, seeing their children's enthusiasm for learning about different cultures, began to soften their stance. However, Margaret's isolation deepened. In the teacher's lounge, conversations stopped when she entered. Some colleagues refused to acknowledge her presence, while others maintained purely professional interactions. Her attempts at redemption seemed caught between those who couldn't forgive and those who saw her as a cautionary tale. One morning, Margaret found her classroom vandalized with hateful messages, not from opponents of diversity, but from those who felt her continued presence at the school was an insult. David faced a difficult decision, protecting a teacher trying to reform while acknowledging the ongoing hurt her presence caused. The new curriculum started showing positive results. Students demonstrated increased empathy and cultural awareness. Incidents of discrimination decreased. Even test scores improved as students became more engaged in their now more relevant studies. But these successes came at a cost. Some families withdrew their children from the school. Funding battles intensified. David faced increasing pressure from certain board members to return to basics. The price of progress became increasingly clear, measured in both institutional resistance and personal consequences. The school's transformation had become a lightning rod for broader community tensions. Social media exploded with competing hashtags, #Support Lincoln Heights competing with #Save Traditional Education. Local news vans became a regular sight outside the school, their presence a constant reminder of the spotlight the community was under. David's latest challenge came in the form of a packed parent meeting in the school cafeteria. The room had been divided, literally and figuratively, with supporters on one side and opponents on the other. The tension was palpable as David stood at the podium, facing the crowd. "Our children are being used as political pawns," shouted one parent, standing up abruptly. "This isn't education anymore, it's indoctrination." Murmurs of agreement rippled through one side of the room, while the other side bristled with contained anger. Jasmine sat in the front row, watching as parents argued about her experiences as if she weren't there. The weight of being both a symbol and a student had begun to wear on her. Her grades had started to slip, and dark circles under her eyes testified to sleepless nights. The opposition had organized themselves effectively. They presented a petition with over 1,000 signatures demanding the removal of the new curriculum. They'd hired an educational consultant who argued that the changes were detrimental to academic excellence and divisive to community values. During the meeting, a parent who supported the changes tried to speak about their child's improved self-esteem and engagement in school. They were shouted down by opponents claiming they were playing the race card. The meeting devolved into chaos, with security having to separate arguing parents. Outside the meeting, Jasmine overheard snippets of conversations that made her question everything. "This wouldn't have happened if that girl had just followed the rules," one parent said. "Now look at what she's done to our school." The words hit her like physical blows. That evening, Jasmine broke down in her room. "Maybe they're right," she told her father through tears. "Maybe I should have just kept quiet. Look at all this fighting, all this hate. Maybe it's not worth it." The confident leader of STAND had been replaced by an exhausted, discouraged teenager. David struggled to balance his roles as principal and father. He watched his daughter's spirit flagging under the pressure, even as he fought administrative battles to keep the changes in place. The school board was split, with some members pushing for his resignation. The local paper ran a series of opinion pieces about the controversy. Letters to the editor revealed deep divisions in the community. Some praised the school for progressive leadership, while others condemned it for destroying traditional values. The debate had moved far beyond a single incident with a teacher and a student's hair. Community businesses began taking sides. Some displayed "We support Lincoln Heights" signs in their windows, while others proudly proclaimed their support for traditional education values. The division affected everything from little league teams to church congregations. As the meeting ended in discord, Jasmine sat alone in the emptying cafeteria, wondering if change was truly possible or if the price was too high. The vision of unity she'd fought for seemed further away than ever. The annual school fundraising gala, typically a routine event, had transformed into a pivotal moment for Lincoln Heights. The elegant hotel ballroom was filled with an uneasy mix of supporters and opponents, all dressed in their finest attire but maintaining a careful distance from each other. Behind the scenes, Margaret Peterson made an unexpected appearance, clutching a thick folder. She'd requested to speak at the event, a request that had divided the organizing committee. David had ultimately agreed, despite concerns from many, including Jasmine. As the evening progressed, it became clear that Margaret was attempting to sabotage the event. She circulated among influential donors, sharing what appeared to be documents about the school's declining test scores and increasing disciplinary issues, all allegedly tied to the new policies. The situation reached its breaking point when Margaret approached the podium uninvited. "I have evidence," she announced, her voice shaking, "that these changes are destroying our school." The room fell silent as she began pulling out papers. But Jasmine, who had been watching carefully, recognized something in Margaret's demeanor. She whispered to her father, "She's scared. This isn't about us anymore." David nodded, understanding dawning on his face. Moving to the podium, David gently but firmly took control. "Mrs. Peterson, before you continue, I think it's time we share something with everyone." He produced his own folder, containing records of Margaret's past incidents, a pattern of discrimination that had been buried by previous administrators. The revelation was stunning. Years of complaints, covered up or dismissed. Students who had transferred out. Parents who had been silenced. Margaret's crusade against Jasmine hadn't been an isolated incident, it had been the culmination of years of unchecked behavior. As the evidence was presented, Margaret's composure crumbled. "I was trying to help them," she insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. "I wanted them to succeed in the real world." The room watched as years of justification fell away, revealing the fear and prejudice beneath. Jasmine, in an unexpected moment of grace, approached Margaret. "The real world is changing," she said softly. "And you can either change with it or be left behind." The symbolism of the moment, the student offering wisdom to the teacher, wasn't lost on anyone. The community's response was immediate and decisive. Several board members who had opposed the changes publicly apologized. Parents who had been on the fence stepped forward to offer support. Even some of the most vocal critics fell silent, unable to defend Margaret's revealed history. In the aftermath, Margaret resigned, but not before issuing a genuine apology, not just to Jasmine, but to every student she had ever discriminated against. The school board unanimously voted to make the new curriculum permanent and to establish a diversity oversight committee. The gala, which had nearly become a disaster, transformed into a celebration of change. Donations poured in, not just from local supporters but from national organizations impressed by the school's commitment to reform. As the evening drew to a close, Jasmine stood at the podium one final time. Her hair had grown back, now worn proudly in its natural state. "This was never just about hair," she said. "It was about dignity, respect, and the right to be ourselves. And today, we've proven that change is possible when we stand together." The story of Lincoln Heights became a case study in educational reform, but for those who lived through it, it was something more personal, a reminder that sometimes the greatest changes start with a single act of resistance, and that the hardest battles often lead to the most meaningful victories.